All right. Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, Dennis. Uh, Opera, in its many forms, was a huge part of traditional life in Sichuan, and the Sichuanese are proud of it. Human operas can be performed by the shadow troops, but the reverse isn't necessarily true. Plays with many supernatural deities who change themselves into other forms, plays with astonishing feats of martial prowess can only be undertaken by talented and agile puppets and puppeteers. Shadow theater, a type of regional opera, was once popular throughout China, with major traditions in the Northeast, in the central areas around Shanxi and Shanxi, and in Sichuan. And it was really for the entertainment of the gods, who were always acknowledged prior to each performance. With its brilliantly colored puppets backlit on a screen, it was a precursor to film and television. Troops of puppeteers set up stages and performed fantastic tales, accompanied by singers and musicians for annual celebrations and private gatherings. This is a presentation about storytelling in Sichuan Shadow Theater. I will talk about some context, what a performance involves, some of the dramas, and some current reinventions and some conclusions. Shadow theater came to Southwest China from other places. It's got a complicated and mixed history. There is likely an indigenous form of shadow theater that doesn't exist anymore, no remains, but there was marionette theater in the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 mostly, and many other diversions. And based on what we know, the shadow figures of that era were not as ornate as the ones that we have, some of which date to the Qing Dynasty, which was the last dynasty in China. So to fill out the historical context, I will borrow information from other places. During the Song Dynasty, which is from 960 to 1297, I think, 79, we're fortunate to have several fascinating accounts of the cultural life in the two capitals. China was invaded from the northern Jurchid peoples, and so they had to shift, the Song had to shift their capital first from Kaifeng, which was called Bianliang, all the way to the southeast to current day Hangzhou, which was called Lin'an. And like other times, even though there's invasion and upheaval, the cultural life of cities and villages thrived. And there's records of people enjoying and witnessing performances from 1,000 years ago. The lively entertainment districts of the northern and southern Song capitals are captivating. These areas are known as the tile districts, supposedly because people easily came together and then dispersed, like stacks of tiles that fall apart and disassemble. It was a site where people of worth and commoners were completely uninhibited and without restraint. And it was also the gate through which young wastrels passed to fritter away their time and come to total ruin. From a description of Bianliang Kaifeng in its heyday between 1102 and 1125, with a population of about 1 million people, we know there are several large theaters and that these venues could hold several thousand people, or at least 1,000 people. So, and there were maybe 6 entertainment districts in that capital, and maybe 50 playhouses. A whole lot of different types of entertainment could be seen, and there were apparently 30 shadow troops. The other entertainments included singers of bawdy songs, dancers, acrobats, tellers of jokes and riddles, martial artists, child wrestlers, twirlers of dishes on long rods, experts in narrative storytelling of histories and classics, and trainers of beasts and bugs. These were enmeshed in the streets where medicine vendors, food stalls, cutters of paper designs, and sellers of hexagram fortunes appeared every day, rain or shine, well into the night. And the shadow theater performers apparently formed a guild, and the members included both men and women. And then in the Southern Song, there were also permanent theaters, and especially during Lantern Festival, which lasts for several days at the beginning of the year, there were huge audiences thronging the temples where shadow performances took place. Even the Emperor Gaozong was, the retired Emperor Gaozong had a birthday party put on by his son, the current Emperor Xiaozong, that involved shadow theater. And there's another description of how they made shadow figures from paper and then carved bamboo. And then they became more clever and carved the likenesses of men from sheepskin and adorned them with colors so they would not deteriorate. They lack nothing in their storytelling. Their accounts are just about the same as tellers of historical books, generally half true and half false. The noble and loyal are carved with upright demeanor, the wicked and perverse with ugly mien. This is to put praise and blame in among their stories. By this account, shadow theater performers were competing with the storytellers, who also had at their disposal the 17 dynastic histories. And the shadow plays were likely prosometric in nature, which means prose and poems or lyrics alternate. Legends of the local people in northern Sichuan say that at the end of the Ming and the start of the Qing, which is the 17th century, military troops brought Hubei shadow theater to their region. And then in the where did Hubei go? Hunan, Wuhan, Hubei. In the mid 18th century, the troops and armies of Wu Sangui, who was a Ming general, brought a type of theater from Yunnan into Sichuan. So these types from the east and the south, along with the indigenous forms, are known as Tudang Ying, or earth lantern shadows. And a source notes that a troupe existed near current-day Mianyang City in 1741. There's an oral history that accounts for a Zhao family troupe with 240 years of history. We also have shadows coming from Shanxi into northern Sichuan by the Jiaqing era, which is the end of the 18th century and into the early part of the 19th. So the earth lantern shadows and the Weinan shadows appear in western Sichuan, and then another form, these form into what is known as the intricate shadows of Chengdu. From the Ming through the Qing until the late 20th century, we have three types of shadows. The Chengdu shadows, also known as lantern shadows, are known for their intricate styles and come in three height sizes, and the tallest being about 32 inches. They're carved from cowhide, and they rival in form and elegance the other types from Beijing, which have a very different profile. These figures are known for having 14 separate pieces, and the removable hat, which is a unique feature. The hat and the head fit into the body in this little place right here, like all the shadow figures, or most shadow figures throughout China. So the rest of the figure is made up of a torso, hips, two legs. We've got two arms, two lower arms, and a hand, which has a opposable thumb. And so there are hinges to connect all these parts. Many shadow troops had at least 2,000 pieces altogether in their trunks. That included sets like palaces and caves. The Chengdu performers had 7 to 12 people in their troops. And the heyday, like with much of shadow theater, was the Qing era. And by the end of the Qing and the early Republican era, there are maybe only 16 troops performing in Chengdu, performing in different musical styles, which are also common to opera, involving the high-pitched sounds of huqin and other clappers and small, like drums and cymbals and gongs. The repertoire is divided between civil and military, and the local puppeteers have been known to say, we've got the Tang 3000, the Song 800, and we'll never finish performing the Three Kingdoms. A master performer in Chengdu had about 200 plays memorized. We have the Chuanqi tales that date maybe to the Tang Dynasty and other innovations in writing and literature that influence both opera content and shadow theater. These Chuanqi tales involve the supernatural, involving immortals, deities, ghosts, and demons. I'm showing a few other types of narrative storytelling and sharing of information. The northern Sichuan shadows are also known as the Weinan shadows because they also came from Weinan in Shanxi. And they're about the same size as the Chengdu shadows and come in 3 sizes and are also made of cowhide. You can see in the image that there are shadowy rods that control the puppets and their arms. And this is what the performers hold on to from behind the backlit screen. The performers refer to their shadow figures as menshen, or as deities of the gates or the doors. And this is another reference to the importance of the spiritual world in shadow theater. The northern shadows have many different types of heads, as you can see here, and you may not be able to see very clearly, but the headdresses, the helmets, they don't detach from the actual head itself like the Chengdu shadows, but they're carved all as one piece. The troop sizes are smaller, of only 3 to 5 people, and there's some different types of musical accompaniment that are maybe plucked strings, but always there's percussion. There's thousands of dramas in their repertoire, but the Northern Shadows are known for having mostly episodic plays, such as Investiture of the Gods, Journey to the West, Xioji, and the stories of the Sanguo Yanyi. My colleague Fanpan Chen visited 11 shadow troops in 1997 in Santai County, Sichuan, and other troops farther east in Shanxi. And at that time, the 65-year-old master puppeteer performed with his musicians. He was able to manipulate 5 large Sichuan figures in each hand during intensive warfare scenes. And like other master puppeteers in that region, he worked from memory and handled both recitation and the manipulation by himself. This is a map showing Chengdu, and to the northeast is a place called Baoning, which was also Langzhong, which is where I've shown you several images of the same 2 horsemen fighting. This is a very ancient town in northeast Sichuan, a former capital, briefly during the Qing. And interestingly, it was guarded for 7 years by Zhang Fei, the historical deified figure during the Three Kingdoms period after the fall of the Han, as the capital of the state of Ba. And there's temple there, one temple that's been rebuilt numerous times. Another point, the last type of shadow figure type known is paper shadows. I don't have any images. These are much smaller, maybe 8 inches high. And they're the shadows that are made by children for New Year's celebrations. Also colored and covered with tung oil. And I can only imagine how fun these would have been. Apparently, after the civil wars in the 1930s, these shadow figures were not to be found anymore. But it's possible that people might make some again. I would like to emphasize that there were many, many occasions for performing shadow theater that also had to do with the agricultural calendar, celebrating and feasting over harvests and good fortune. Also during birthday celebrations, especially for the birth of the sun, you would hire shadow troops. Also for funerals, there are certain plays that are related to the deaths of people that are related to you. And in one tradition, shadow theater sponsored plays both in urban and rural settings, annual rituals exorcising plague spirits. At this time, the play Mulian Saves His Mother, Mulian Jiumu, was performed. This is a Buddhist play that is very complicated, but I'm sure some of you have heard about it. So the idea was that unless you put on these plays acknowledging the power of the gods, that more ominous forces will appear and they need to be exorcised. So we have performance involving these brightly colored translucent parchment figures with detachable heads. This is common all over China. The limbs and moves are joined together and they move. And we've got these scripts that are either in the heads of the puppeteers or referred to during a performance. There's also another very important aspect which both the opera stars and the puppeteers share, which is the role types. And I will briefly go over these. These are sheng, examples of sheng, which are the male leads, usually represented by promising scholars, patriotic warriors, upright statesmen, and loyal retainers. You can see their faces include only very small parts of rawhide. The rest is blank. And there are wrinkles indicated for older figures, or more aged figures, rather. These are the Dan, the female leads, who run the gamut from honest courtesans, outspoken daughters, women warriors, clever maids, ingenious servants, and flirtatious seductresses. As with the other types, we've got the head and the clothing indicate status and their roles as serious people or military people or honest or dishonest people. The clown figure is either malicious or just simple and not malicious. Often the butt of jokes. The clowns are males, but there are some female clowns. We have bumbling officials, dishonest leaders, and the distinctive white patch around the eyes indicates when someone is a clown. The very important jing or painted face role indicates the heroic or the evil characters. They're not always human. They can be dangerous bandits, crafty ministers, rebel princes, but also righteous judges and steadfast statesmen. These figures don't have their hats on, but their faces are very intricately carved. And not least of all, are the Shen and Gui, which are the deities and the demons, which include sea creatures, animals, ghosts, plants, spirits of plants, rocks, and other creatures who might have once been human. They are depicted in with much more leather rawhide showing, either in full face or 3/4 face, and they're very colorful. Shadow theater interprets history and legend to tell these highly entertaining stories, carrying messages subtly and not so subtly. There's also mockery in the system, and these tales, as I have pointed out, come from history, and the stories can then diverge from the history to emphasize romance, affection, collegiality, friendship, and even religious devotion. This image doesn't have you cannot see the faces of these two upright figures very well, but we have the female warrior who would very much like to marry this young man. And these are the foot soldiers that are dressed in the style of the Qing Manchu military establishment. You can tell by their hats. This one is a clown, and this one just seems to be more steadfast. The stories have been dominated by this very long episodic, well-known story about sort of the origins of China, called The Investiture of the Gods. And I have many shadow troops have hundreds of figures that could be used in this epic tale of at least 100 chapters, at least in the written form. This of a novel that was written in the Ming. It involves a series of battles that culminate in a preordained conclusion and the taming of malevolent forces by ennobling them and giving them places and titles within the pantheon of Daoist deities. It's quite a process. I can't be at all nuanced or subtle about it here. The story is set about 3,000 years ago, before China was an empire. There's a corrupt dynastic house, and then the challenging dynastic house, the Shang, is challenged by the Zhou. And they are both seen to be following two different sects of Taoism. The conflicts involve immense battles with innumerable types of weaponry, involving tens of thousands of humans and immortals. And there's a huge amount of bloodshed. Even Lao Tzu and the Buddha end up in these battle formations. And it concludes with control over the demonic forces. But it indicates that the world of humans and spirits is inextricably mixed. These are two thunder deities. You've got sort of a human-like body with a bird-like head, wearing a Daoist kind of crown. This guy's got an axe, and this one has maybe a horn or some other stabbing device. This hand has been remade. I think it's a type of weapon. That's not my area of expertise, but I have been enthralled by this tale for quite some time. And the bird claws for the feet make this very clear that this is a deity, as do these wonderful bright red tufts above the ears, that this is not a human creature. I recommend this story if you haven't known it at all. But it's not the only classic tale. Back to the Han Dynasty, which is so significant. it comes to ruin and there's rebellion. Um, this is a map that I took great interest in because it indicates that these people apparently with yellow bandanas were raging all over China, rebelling, and they needed to be controlled, of course. But the troubles are indicated by crossed swords and these bright red flaming bits, which mean probably cities and whole areas are burning up. So The Romance of the Three Kingdoms is the subject matter of another novel that comes out several hundred years ago, 14th century. It was a story already well known and deals with the military conflicts from around 220 in the Common Era, where after the Han, the states of Wei, Shu, and Wu are being established. The emperor, the emperor of the Han appeals for loyal subjects to join the army and fight off these rebels, even though his court is corrupt and falling apart. There is a chancellor named Cao Cao who has got ideas of his own about plotting to overthrow the throne. He is depicted in white face, indicating treachery and cunning. And there are thin black lines around the corners of his eyes that further emphasize his shrewd and duplicitous nature. I wish I had an example ready to show you. However, we have Guan Yu here. In a previous life, he had killed someone of importance and was a fugitive, but he eventually becomes a venerated figure and deified as Lord Guan. His painted face is red, signifying loyalty and bravery. Next to him is another man named Zhang Fei, who is also later deified. He's straightforward and dignified, and his face is mostly black with some white highlights. Liu Bei, this is a stunning figure. You can see the control rods very clearly. It's fairly, I think this figure must be close to 3 feet tall. His other name is also called Hidden Virtue. And he was remotely related to this Han ruling house and is trying to bring it back together. But he breaks with the chancellor because he knows he's plotting. Liu Bei's wives and Guan Yu have been captured by Cao Cao, who treats them with exaggerated generosity because he wants Guan Yu's allegiance. And there's, of course, Zhuge Liang. I can't go on and on, but what we have here is a very complicated and fascinating plot. So traditionally, we have Guan Yu, and in fact, in the novel, he's described as this very dignified person whose face is the color of a dark jujube with lips that were red and plump. His eyes were like those of a crimson phoenix, and his eyebrows resemble reclining silkworms. He looked quite majestic. He's represented this way in both opera and shadow theater and statuary. He's quite loyal and righteous. And we have in this is taken from a scene that is depicted in the Sichuan University Art Museum. That is the 28th chapter of the novel. I'm not sure which chapter it is in the shadow theater performance, but performances would go on for many, many nights, for several hours each night. In this scene, we have Zhang Fei encountering Guan Yu. They've had a rupture in their friendship because Zhang Fei feels that Guan Yu has gone over to the other side, the side of Cao Cao. And he doesn't trust him and he's challenging him. And there is quite a bit of dialogue. They have sworn brotherhood, and Zhang Fei feels very strongly, how can you face me? You've betrayed our older brother and submitted to Cao Cao, accepting rank and title. And now you expect something from me? Let's settle this here once and for all. And there's more discussion. And so Guan Yu, who always seems to maintain his composure, says, well, to defeat you, I would need an army. And Zhang Fei says, and what's that? Guan Yu sees behind him a crowd of riders in a haze of dust. It is Cao Cao's army. Do you still dispute it, says Zhang Fei menacingly. And Guan Yu replies, I will execute their leader to demonstrate my true thoughts. And he does. There is a reconciliation between the two that indicates their loyalty once again is strong. And eventually Liu Bei joins them again. We have another scene from the Three Kingdoms story where a minor character named Huang Gai has appeared to make a fake plot in order to fool Cao Cao's army. These are the events leading up to the very famous decisive Battle of the Red Cliffs, in which Cao Cao's army is eventually defeated by a much smaller group from the south. It's a fictional episode, but it's very entertaining. He has had a secret conversation. This is the figure of Huang Gai, and this is his commander, Zhou Yu, I believe. So Huang Gai has said that he's going to try to defect, basically. He challenges Zhou Yu, and all this word gets out to Cao Cao's army. And so they do this entire completely staged event where in order to get Cao Cao to believe that his army will be defeating the other ones, and that Huang Gai and his troops will defect, basically. And so this scene is called the ruse of the self-torture strategy, where he's agreeing to be flogged or beaten or killed in order to, because he's showing that he's defecting. But it's all a ruse. And the figures in this scene are all depicted as lead males. They're open-faced, they're not treacherous at all. But in this scene, they are trying to get word out that they have other things in mind. It's much more exciting to watch the plays rather than hear me try to describe them. There's another story, another of many, many stories, that is known in English as the Butterfly Lovers. It also takes place in this period after the end of the Han, and in fact, in what is a dynasty known as the Eastern Jin. And the standard abbreviated plot involves a wealthy young woman named Zhu Yingtai, who disguises herself as a man in order to study. She meets and feels an affinity with the scholar Liang Shangbo, and they swear a fraternal oath. She has fallen for him, but has to return home suddenly. They've studied together for 3 years, and he is oblivious to the fact that she is a female. She has already decided that she wants to be with him for all time, and she gives a token of betrothal in the form of a jade pendant to him via the headmaster's wife. So Liang Shangbo still doesn't understand that his classmate is not a fellow, and there is much beautiful poetry and singing in this story, both in opera and in shadow theater. Finally, as she's about to leave, she suggests that he marry her sister so that he will have to visit them, and off she goes. Months later, he visits her family and finally realizes that she is herself and becomes passionately devoted to her. But her parents have, of course, betrothed her to a wealthy merchant. Liang's heart breaks. By now he's a county magistrate and he dies with his boots on. So the marriage of Zhu Yingtai is taking place, but heaven seems to intervene in the form of strong winds just as the bride's procession passes the grave of Liang Shanbo. Zhu, in her misery, prays for the grave to open, and bingo, it does with a thunderous clap. She leaps in with Tosca-like flair from the battlements to join her lover in death, and they are united as butterflies disappearing together into the sky. Now, that is a very famous story. My colleague Fan discovered that creative reworking of famous tales occurs in oral traditions. And this is one example from this story dating back hundreds of years of the lovers of Liang Shanbo and Zhu Yingtai. When she was interviewing that shadow puppeteer up in the northeastern part of Sichuan, she learned that he or their troupe put a different ending to this story. Instead of this tragic ending of the butterflies heading off, they become instead adepts to the sects of the immortals who have intervened, and they enlist them and give them titles. And so they are born again as warriors for the cause. I suppose it's for the jinn. I thought this was rather interesting. So I've briefly given you some ideas of things that are going on in shadow theater. Perhaps I might have shortened things faster than I realized. We have the idea that shadow theater continues, and here we have an image from the huge art museum in Chengdu with many, many displays of shadow figures that are backlit from all over China. And so I do this research trying to figure out the shadow figures and their plays and connect these disparate pieces. But it's possible because of the scholars and the collections that have done work before me. Scholars in China and in Europe and in America. Based my work heavily on what Professor Jiang Yushang in Sichuan has done. But many shadow figures have escaped Sichuan and ended up in places like Germany and the United States in the 1930s. For example, the Leather Museum in Offenbach near Frankfurt and the Berlin Ethnographic Museum have old collections. How did this happen? So one of these collections that came from Chengdu ends up in Berlin and in Offenbach. And there was a scholar named Dr. Max Bormann who used these shadow figures to perform various scenes. And the information he had about what the puppeteers were performing were from some shadow play scripts that had been collected in Beijing by Berthold Laufer in the early part of the 20th century. So Max Bormann formed a shadow troupe that he called the Group of Three Plum Blossoms, and he performed using shadow figures from Sichuan using texts from Beijing to enthralled audiences in 1930s Germany. So how still did these figures end up in Max Bormann's hands? Because here they are in Chengdu in maybe the 1920s. There is a history, and the history involves a man named Karl Egger, who was born in Württemberg in Germany. His father operated a sawmill, and I think town life was not quite doing it for him. He was born in 1879. So in the history that I've read, it says, whatever might have moved him, be it a thirst for adventure or dissatisfaction with his possibilities, he volunteered for the Imperial Navy, which his father, pastor, colleagues, and friends advised against. Despite the widespread Wilhelmine maritime cheering patriotism, so he deploys to Qingdao. He ends up on a boat heading to Shanghai. Qingdao is a German possession in northeast China. He liked his life on board and was interviewed later, where we get this information. It sounds like that he was also kind of culturally minded and lived in Chengdu for quite some time. And he made it for some Chengdu youth to study. We have a very small picture of him. Here is Karl Egger, and I believe this is a troupe of shadow performers. And here is a representative from one of the American oil companies. This is dated to probably 1929 or 30 in Chengdu. As a trader, Karl Egger acquired from the shadow puppeteer company, in exchange for an annuity, all the material on shadow puppets, which had become worthless to these people after the Chinese there too had become addicted to cinema and the old actors had become unemployed. So that's a version of history. After Karl Egger's death in 1933, the collection was inherited by one of his relatives, and there were at least 1,000 pieces, including small figures and large figures, sets, heads, all the things. They end up in Germany, and they're quite well received, as we've seen. One of the people that worked on these was a woman named Brunhilde Lessing, and she had been involved with one of these trips to Asia that investigated ethnology and the ethnography. So she had quite a few. She was a scholar, in other words, and she worked on these figures, but was writing a manuscript. But in Germany, there was a war going on, and she wrote to the cousin of Egger, "We acted as best we could when we brought your figures to safely, because only recently have they, the English airmen, been destroying quite a bit, more than was officially admitted." So she then evacuates to Poland and does her best to kind of wrap up and box these shadow figures. So some of them end up being sold to the museum in Offenbach, and others end up in the museum in Berlin. And this is an example of what you can find online. In the Berlin Folklore Museum, which is another huge edifice. A considerable part was apparently destroyed during the war or lost to dishonest machinations after the end of the war. It is noticeable that large sets such as temples, palaces, and topographical segments like rocks and mountains, which are known from other collections, are simply missing. And Professor Jiang is also aware of this collection. So I came across these in various trips to Germany, and have only recently figured out this kind of interesting connection that sort of echoes the situations of repeated wars that have also raged in all over the world. So this is just a sort of aside, basically. But shadow figures from Sichuan continue to compel people. And just a week ago, I enjoyed a very interesting presentation of a story using shadow puppets from Sichuan um, that was performed via film in Portland. Um, here is another great image that shows the variety of shadow figures that are part of the Sichuan style. Some of you might have been there as well last Friday. It was available online as well. So Mr. Ran Sheng, who's a graphic artist, now graduated from Pacific Northwest College of Art, made an original stop motion animated film using new technology and old Sichuan shadow figures. He took about 8 months from start to finish, a time frame that reflects the dedication and imagination of the practitioners of a previous era. Clearly, a traditional medium inspired him to tell a tale. Reanimating Sichuan shadow figures are appreciated by audiences far distant in time and space. In whatever form, these stylized shadow figures from Southwest China attract many admirers, including me. So at the urging of Dennis Lee, I have given you about 45 minutes of commentary regarding this tradition. As I've noted, the medium of light and shadow lends itself to transformations of the human form, not simply changing clothes or putting on military garb versus court wear, but youth and age and changing from innocence to being possessed by demons and going to the dark side. And we also, I hope I've shared with you some of the excitement of shadow theater. So these stories that the shadow masters have performed are based on their interpretations of their connections with the world of spirits and humans. And sadly, another aspect which I'm emphasizing but not able to present is the sound of shadow theater, which can be quite loud and raucous. And if you cannot see the shadow figures, you can hear the music and know the stories because they are ubiquitous throughout the region and China. And with that, I think I'm a little early, but I am going to conclude my talk. And I will be happy to take as many questions as people have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was lovely and so informative. And I loved hearing about the different stories that they present with those puppets. Yes, as Mary said, if you guys have questions, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type in your question. If you can't find that, you can also put it in the chat. We'll try to monitor that as well. We'll get started because we've had some questions already. So this is exciting. Our first question comes from Ray. Was there a guild or specific group that made and painted the puppets, or was each troupe capable of these tasks?
That's a very good question. I believe that within, at least for the later period, I don't know about the early times, but we know that there was a guild in Song times 1,000 years ago. That was the puppeteers, but it doesn't indicate that there were separate professions of designers and carvers versus the performers. I think that gathering a rawhide from an animal and getting to the sweet spot within the hide itself requires a lot of work to get that translucent part of the hide. In general, since the puppeteers are also farmers and people working the land and working with animals, they have many talents. And so I think it depends on the actual group, puppet group, but in general, I'd say that the people that perform have also know how to carve and color, though depending on the abilities and the size of the troupe and who else is available, I think that some people would tend towards performance as opposed to the preparation of the shadow figures. But since there used to be a lot of troupes in different regions, there was a fair amount of collaboration. And I think that if someone's voice was not so good, that there could be somebody else who would step in, or if a shadow figure got pretty beat up in some battles or covered with the smoke from a lamp, that there would be a certain amount of sharing among the troops of shadow performers. They needed some metal to form the part of the rods that they controlled the shadow figures with, and in this current day, since the form has changed so much, and there's no money, there's no livelihood to be made being a performer. The calendar has changed, the belief systems have changed. There are people that are just making shadow figures for sale, and some of them are quite good and recognized by the government of China as being experts. And I think you can still go to certain places in outside of Xi'an and maybe farther in Shandong to meet people that are making shadow figures. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was great. You touched on this just in your answer right there, but if you could go into more detail about the current production that you mentioned, are they still using the traditional materials? Are they still doing the rawhide and the paints? How about, like, what are those made of? If you can speak a little more on those.
That's another good question. There are at least two different kinds of shadow figures being made in China currently that I'm aware of. The ones that are using rawhide and are handmade and hand carved with various tools. There's certain leather working tools that are certain shapes, so you can punch little holes of crescents or certain designs that can make a very detailed shadow figure. And then there are laser cut shadow figures using, probably they could use rawhide, but there's also other man-made materials that I don't know exactly what they are, types of mylar or plastic film that emulates the actual animal product. And many of these are being sold as authentic. My colleague, Annie Katsura-Rollins, I think there's a reference to her website on some materials available on the First Saturday website, has focused on this to a certain extent because she really, and I agree with her, wants people to be aware that this is going on, that because the shadow figures are so lovely, there's been a kind of a demand to make them and sell them for tourists, Chinese as well as foreigners. And if you look closely at her website, you can detect that there's a difference in quality and detail between a handmade shadow figure and one that is carved using a laser. The main difference, and it's also a matter of preference. Some people, there's a greater perfection with something cut by a laser. There are no little weird mistakes or irregularities or quirky parts as well. So I would say that there's shadow figure making is alive and well And many of the figures are recognizable characters from, again, the Three Kingdoms or Journey to the West, and various romances with more very intricate gowns, etc. The colors are quite bright now, and the original coloring of shadow figures really involved maybe 3 different tones: a red, a kind of a greenish color, and a bit of yellow, and definitely black. I think these were naturally derived pigments from sources that I am not clear about, but there is a mixing of these pigments with animal glue, which is, made from, which becomes kind of a sticky, viscous kind of material that you can float your pigments in and then paint them onto the shadow figure. Many of the figures are kind of shiny, and that's because they've been coated with a type of oil known as tong oil, which can also be very sticky. The collections, many collections have had to disadhere their puppets from each other. Tong oil, it comes from the tong tree, which I think is mostly in southern China and different parts of Asia. But it's a preservative, and not that rawhide rots very quickly, but it also adds to the translucent nature of the shadow figures. I hope that I've not just talked myself into a corner on this one. There's much more to be known about the actual pigments from earlier times, but as I understand from, to get a sample, you've got to get somebody with an old shadow figure who will agree to let you chip off a bit of the pigment so that a scientific analysis can be made. And I still have not heard exactly what the pigments are, but maybe somebody else has. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was great. I'd love to hear about all the new things that are happening and keeping the art and the performance alive. Our next comment and question comes from our filmmaker, Rong Chen, that you mentioned. The question is first, actually, thank you for such an educational presentation. Comments first. With the COVID-19 situation lasting for more than 2 years and still ongoing, how are these troops doing in Sichuan region? I imagine their show business could be very challenging.
I think things have come to a halt. We know China has been, at least Shanghai and Beijing are currently kind of locked down. I just don't think people are doing much of anything except virtually like we are. I don't have up-to-date information. There are really not active troops in the Sichuan region, at least not in Chengdu. I think that sadly, there's a need for tourism to bring audiences back. But I will note that I had several images of these 2 equestrian figures that no doubt was, one of them had to have been Guan Yu on his red horse with his red face. And all these images that I have found on the web have come from this one little smaller town, which is probably at least 1 million people in Northeast China, Northeast Sichuan, where this Wang family has maintained their shadow museum and their performances. I have not been there. I would like to go. But these photos date from 2011. And I think that they probably have been performing since then, but I'm guessing that it's possible that in a somewhat rural setting, they might have been continuing to perform. It's it's definitely the case that you need not only the performers, but you also need musicians. And if you don't have musicians, then you'll have a pre-recorded kind of soundtrack, which is also an innovation if it works. And so the shadow puppeteers would probably have microphones and simply do the dialogues and the singings over the tune types that are available on as things that you could set up on your phone and simply play. It's for someone like me who has not done field work or even lived in Imperial China, I just feel, traditions change and evolve. And so we have to accept that the world of traditional China, for all its good parts and bad parts, is no longer. And so to maintain shadow theater currently is to reimagine it. And if it involves pre-recorded sounds, there are some voices and puppeteers who were recorded in the Beijing and Shanghai areas on wax cylinders. And these are held in like the University of Indiana and various places. I think it's possible to sort of put together some previous worlds, but it's still trying to do something that isn't as lively as what innovation could do right now. There may be a resurgence, a greater resurgence, because shadow theater has been recognized as an intangible culture, part of the intangible cultural heritage of China. And so it's been part of other types of performances that involve supernatural deities recreated using, light, shadow, smoke, dry ice, the whole works. So I'm eager for us to be able to gather again, to be able to enjoy live performances. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great to agreed. Definitely live performances are definitely ready for them to come back. Our next question is somewhat related. It's about the troupes that are performing. Are there nationally recognized shadow theater troupes that perform today? And have they been around? I mean, not just today, but historically as well as today, or today.
Yes, the answer to that is yes. I think that the current performers are much younger than the traditional shadow troupe performers. The image that I showed of the black and white images of a man in a traditional Chinese gown holding up his shadow figure and his troupe. From what I've seen of other older photos, the practitioners became elderly, very talented, very lively, very energetic. And many of them are just simply not around anymore. And they haven't been able, from my understanding, there weren't so many people that wanted to really study and memorize the tradition. However, there have been recordings made of some of these performers. And for example, I think that in the 90s, a movie was made called To Live, 活着, that had a few scenes. This was adapted from a novel about all the goings on in China through the end of the dynasty and wars, revolutions, etc. This one man manages to hold on to a collection of shadow figures as his life parallels the chaos of China. There were professional shadow performers that can be seen in that movie. I don't know how many of them are still alive, but it's only a few seconds of film footage, but that was a famous troupe from Xiaoyi Shanxi near Xi'an or north of Xi'an. And that's one place where they've been recognized. But since then, there have been several international conferences regarding performing arts, and especially puppetry and marionette puppetry. And one was held in Sichuan in, I think, 2016 in a place called Nanchong, which is also in this northeast, was not Chengdu. There was one in Chengdu, but Nanchong region also includes that area where I showed on the map, northeast of Chengdu. Lots of puppetry going on in that region, and they're very, there are a number of people that are part of this intangible cultural heritage. Artists have also become interested in depicting, using shadow theater style to depict scenes, huge scenes. I mean, there are shadow figures that are simply made as spectacles that are the size of humans. And so it takes at least one person to manipulate this giant two-dimensional figure that would not have existed in a previous era, as far as we can see. I think that there's a great pride also in the Northeast region, in around Beijing and Shandong, where the idea that the tradition has had many beautiful, famous makers of shadow figures, and they have been recognized by the countries. There have been performances in Germany and France of shadow troupes, but I'm not aware of the most recent ones. There was a performance in Brussels in 2017 or 2018 that emphasized shadow theater. That was part of the conference held by Chime, which is an organization devoted to the music and performance of musical types in China. I'm kind of all over the map here, and I'm feeling but I need to know a bit more of what's really going on currently. But there's no sort of direct conduit to having people train and have livelihoods with shadow theater in China. I think it's taught, some teachers employ shadow theater or have lessons regarding shadow theater so that kids are aware of this tradition. But the festivals that take place are not the ones that are what they used to be. I think that's the best way to put it. So it's kind of a long, rambling answer. I apologize for that.
That was a great answer. It's amazing to hear about performances all over the world, and that this performance and this art is being shared all over. I think that's encouraging. You mentioned a lot about in your last answer, passing on the tradition. Was there historically a tradition to pass it on within families, or were there particular communities that were specific to just the shadow puppet and theater?
I would say that traditionally, with many professions, this could be considered a profession of sorts, even though people are also busy working the land, that it has been a family tradition. And there are as with the Wong brothers, I'm not able to list different family troupes, but not only in mainland China, but also Taiwan, I think there have been at least one or two generations, fathers have passed on to their sons the tradition of their troupe, and which with it comes the repertoire and the shadow figures. If there's nobody to be making and replenishing the supply of shadow figures as they get, torn and ripped and used, then it's possible that somebody else not in the family would take up, could be employed or imposed upon to make some shadow figures. It's still this mixing, this unique combination of the musicians who know the tune types, who know the local operas, who can be the background sound for the performance. These people are also disappearing. And so maybe this combination of having a family tradition, a particular troupe that employs the local musicians, or several troupes that depend on local musicians, it's all very tenuous, I think. If there's a really good erhu player around who knows traditional music, and someone who's able to a performer of the percussive parts, I think you could put together a very convincing performance. But yeah, I think because traditional China, also the emphasis on family connections, family troupes would have been more the norm than not. Though people of talent in any field can be adopted into families, and there's no kind of anything conflicting about that happening.
Thank you so much. We're getting close to the end of our time, but we do have a couple more questions. Mary, is it okay if we go past our time for a few minutes?
Sure.
Excellent, thank you. Sabina says, thank you, Mary, for your marvelous presentation. I noticed the female puppets have dainty bound feet, symbol of beauty and high social status. Have you seen a servant-made puppet with unbound feet?
Thank you very much. That's indicates somebody's looking at the details here. Yes, I've seen the female characters with bound feet and unbound feet. I think if you look at probably this tradition, but I'm pretty sure, I haven't looked at all the figures in the collection at the guest library at Princeton. It's a searchable database. You might be able to find a female servant with regular size feet. I could also try to find that for you because it's an interesting thing to see. The norm seems to be that women are depicted with these tiny golden lotus shoes. It's just sort of little, very small thing that is barely recognizable as a shoe on a foot. Whether the female is a warrior or a goddess or a high-ranking noble, somebody in the imperial family or the court, the norm seems to have been to present those tiny feet as impractical and painful as they are for the humans. But yes, not every single female has these tiny feet. And when I see that there's not the small feet, I think, okay, is there a particular story where this particular character would be important? I've got a lot of questions basically, but the shoes depicted can also show these raised platform shoes that are also common in opera, that again, there's a discussion about like which came first, or why are they doing this convention? But the back to the women, they're mostly, yes, they're mostly wearing golden lotus shoes, which is not, even if you've got a story dating back to the Han Dynasty, the women are depicted with those small feet, even though that was not practiced at that time. Interesting. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you. Our next question is, in talking about the kind of 20 classic tales and other popular stories, and you highlighted a few of them, was the purpose of sharing these particular stories, was there a lesson in it, or was it mostly just for entertainment and because they were popular, so they were just became common in being retold? And that links to another comment about, was the puppet theater heavily affected by the Cultural Revolution? Loosely linked.
Yes. So the repertoire is enormous, not just in Sichuan, and it's based on hundreds of years of storytelling and narrative traditions, oral traditions. So theater is just been if you were in China, theater and performances are all over the place. It's just, you can't get around in a city without finding a theater or a temple with a theater in it. And that's for the cities, but also in rural places as well. So this acknowledgement that the world, the traditional world involved the presence of unseen forces, let's say. There's folk beliefs, or however you want to call them, that are simply part of the mentality of people. You propitiate the gods. They're looking down or over, or they're around, and they also find that they wish to be entertained, and being entertained by shadow troops or marionette troops or even live opera is a way of acknowledging that they are being respected. And so for a modern person, it's kind of hard to like, are they just doing lip service, or do they really believe it? These questions have many answers to them, but the stories that end up being told and retold emphasize certain qualities in heroic figures. They let people understand that the family relations of respecting your ancestors, the traditional kind of Confucian values, these are the ways that the societal norms get perpetuated. Through entertainment is a kind of a more lighthearted way, but nevertheless, it's pretty serious that, the idea that if you steal something, or you come, the basic evil versus good things are not significantly different across cultures. You see someone being punished in shadow theater and then ending up in one of the many levels of hell, chopped in half, or having their tongue pulled out, or whatever. It's not just a one-off. I think you're getting the idea. Well, maybe that might happen, but maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should redirect my behavior. I think it's just kind of part of the mindset, and the stories range from these kind of tales of like, please behave or else, to more lighthearted stories that have to do with trouble that is caused, but it all gets reconciled by the end. I mean, the examples of monkey stealing elixirs, or various people kind of going outside of what they should be doing, but there's a resolution in the end, and order is restored. I think this is kind of one way to see a chaotic China where an awful lot of order does not exist. But if you can be diverted by this form, it'll, in a certain way, bring stability while being highly entertaining. The Cultural Revolution. That wasn't something that happened very long ago. And it disrupted culture, life, commerce, family relations, the whole bit of China. And it took place in the China that is modern China, that was established in 1949. So between the beginnings of China as the People's Republic, let me just say that things that were considered traditional, such as shadow theater and opera, belief in gods in temples, these things were banned outright. Temples were destroyed, shadow figure collections were burned, and people were just encouraged to think in different ways and not believe in superstition. It didn't just start with the Cultural Revolution. Modernizing means not doing the things that happen at temples, let's just say. However, shadow theater was also co-opted at an earlier time to put on anti-Japanese plays or anti-foreign aggression plays. And though I don't have a real collection of shadow figures, but I think some of these museums have some pretty interesting figures that are modern figures with bayonets, that are depicting modern stories of China defending itself against invaders from other places, such as the Japanese or the foreigners who took territory and just ran roughshod over China. Nevertheless, people hid their collections successfully, and I think that's why the museum in Chengdu, for example, has a very large collection that they managed to acquire through various through all China. So traditional figures, I mean, these things can be folded up and put in a kind of a compact suitcase or folder or something and be hidden quite well, and that's obviously what happened. That's sort of a long answer to a question, but there's more to say, because the Cultural Revolution was meant to just change China in ways that it couldn't recover from. But I'll leave it at that. That's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know complex question as well, requiring a complex answer. We have run out of time, and there's a couple more comments, and I'll be sure to pass those on to Mary. Thank you everyone for attending and asking your questions and commenting. We love hearing about it. Mary, I just wanted to give you a moment if you have any last words you'd like to say.
No, I'd just like to thank you all for coming, and I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, which could have been smoother, but I'm always happy to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Awesome. And yes, again, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, Mary. It's the depth and breadth of it is amazing, and we love hearing about it and learning more about the shadow puppets and the theater. It's great. Okay, so we're going to wrap up here, and just a reminder of our next month's talk, which is the Dao De Jing's Forgotten Forebear, the Ancestral Cult, with Dr. Ken Brashear. We're super excited about that. If you have any questions, there's our email on there. If you want to look at our past programs and our upcoming program, you can go to our website, which is www.firstsaturdaypdx.org. And let's see. And that is it for that. And just a reminder, we're going to have our tea house in just a few minutes. So if anyone is able to attend, we would love it. We would love to see you and get a chance to chat with you. You can get to that link in your registration confirmation or the reminder that hopefully you got this morning. It's going to be the second link as you scroll a little further down on that email. And we'll start that in a few minutes. So please feel free to take what's called a bio break, grab some tea or a snack, and we'll see you in a few minutes at the tea house. Thank you everyone for attending and have a good rest of the weekend.